Good morning, everybody. I'm Roger Suzanne, live for the Breaking News Desk. We begin with a heart-aching update. We are learning more about the second mass shooting in California in just the last 3 days. We now know that 7 people were killed in the coastal city of Half Moon Bay, which is about 30 miles south of San Francisco. And police say 67-year-old Chun-Li Zhao murdered 4 people at the Magic Mushroom Farm and then another 3 victims at a separate nearby business. And investigators arrested Zhao at a police substation, and they've just announced that they do believe he worked at one of those businesses and that all of the victims were other employees. Well, just hours from now, we might know a lot more about Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. A judge in Atlanta will hear arguments later today on whether or not to release a grand jury report detailing former President Trump's efforts to upend the results and conclusions from the grand jury on whether Trump should actually face criminal charges. Judge Robert McBurney will ultimately decide whether or not that report is made publicly available, so stay tuned. And Ticketmaster now says the Taylor Swift ticket debacle was caused by a cyber attack, and apparently the company just couldn't shake it off. According to Politico, the ticket giant's investigation revealed that their website was hit by hackers, and that led, in their opinion, to massive issues and delays. Still, though, there's some bad blood. Some fans are trying to sue Ticketmaster, and the Justice Department has launched an antitrust investigation. Of course, we'll post more developing news updates throughout the day on the Channel 3 app. Live with the Breaking News Desk, I'm Roger, Suzanne, and Scott. Over to you.
All right.